So today, what I'd like to do is really talk a little bit about some of the people and terms that we are going to be using and talking about throughout this semester. And I know a lot of this is coming at you without any sort of context. And for some of you who've done some of the previous classes, you will sort of have a little bit of background to this, but for many of you, this will be the first time coming across any of this. And so I think it's kind of important that I run through just a few of the brief people and groups of people who will pop up time and time again, just so you have some sort of idea about who's doing what and how. And I'm just going to run through some very brief things there. I have a little slideshow of people, just so you have at least a face to put towards it. So I'm going to share the screen, and you can have a look at who's who in 1714. Now, of course, we are coming into a completely different era, and then we have, because history is ultimately chronological, and events happen in a chronological sequence, but events also happen in response to certain events that have happened before. And much of what happens in the 1700s is, of course, a response to what happens to the 1600s, and what happens in the 1800s is a response to what happens in the 1700s, and so on and so on. So when it comes to these people, I'm going to just come through a couple of major names. The Jacobites. The Jacobites are probably a group that's kind of important for a few years, but they will pale away. They will cease to become very important to us. But at this moment, in 1714, they are still actually quite important. And the Jacobites are people who believe that the reign of James and his heirs really should never have come to an end. Previously, we had a kerfuffle in England about who was going to reign, and a lot of people, being very highly Protestant, didn't like the idea of Catholics ruling the country, and James and his family were quite Catholic, and there was a fair amount of disturbance about what should happen, whether the heir was legitimate or not. And if you really want to look into some of this, you can have a look at some of the lectures from last semester if you desperately want to know about this. But really, to talk about the Jacobites, this is the last vestiges of the people who think that this stuff should still take place. Very often, there are some characteristics of it here. They tend to be Scottish, largely because the Stuarts, which is the line which comes to an end in 1714, they tend to be well, they are the Stuart line is Scottish, and so therefore, quite naturally, the people who support what is going on, and the people who support James II and James III ultimately, are going to be from this time. From this location. There is some overspill into Ireland, largely because of the Catholicism and Northern Englanders, but that's really where it's concentrated. When I say Scottish Highlanders, I mean people in the Scottish Highlands, not all over. It's not all Scotland. It's parts of Scotland, which will gradually, again, as I said, fade away. And there are four tenets within the Jacobites. Firstly, is the divine right of kings. Much of the discussions of what takes place, or has been taking place in the last sort of century or so, is a question of what can a king do and what can a king cannot do. Although that may not be quite very good English, but what can a king do? And the idea really is, should a king be able to do whatever he wants? And there's this idea of a sense of absolutism, which I know these are not particularly sort of American concepts at all, mostly because the Americans revolted largely because of them. But there are certain ideas, I guess, coming back into vogue with Donald Trump recently, complaining about whether he's allowed to do what he wants because he's president. And I guess we've got the same kind of ideas going back, or at least the same ideas back then happening now. But so, should a king be able to do what he wants is really the question. The divine right of kings. As far as the Jacobites are concerned, God has imbued them with power and authority, and they should be able to rule without anybody getting in the way. And that's kind of like a very short version of it, but that's roughly what it is. The second point is about the accountability. Now, normally in most modern governments, we have sort of checks and balances and people who sort of make sure that one person doesn't get too strong, one part of government doesn't become too strong over. In America, you've got the three sort of parts of government. In the UK, we have sort of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. We have technically the monarchy, although they don't really get involved anymore. And some people very often point towards the press as being yet another check on untrammeled power. Back then, the accountability, as far as the Jacobites and many other absolutists, especially on the continent, was that kings were accountable to God alone. You didn't have to respond to anybody else. If you wanted to do something, you could do something. And this is really in response to the English civil wars previously, where the country had split between the monarchists, so to speak, and the parliamentarians, people who believe that Parliament should actually have a say in something. So the nascent, I suppose, change in government was seen a century earlier, or almost a century earlier. But the Jacobites didn't agree that the changes that had taken place since then were legitimate, and therefore kings only had to respond to God. And if God did say anything, then you could do what you want. So there was it. They also believed in inalienable hereditary right. This is really just succession. How does a king pass on his kingdom? Well, he passes it on through his heirs. It's a hereditary thing. It's not to vote. You don't vote people in. It's not ratified by Parliament or any other group of people. That's just how it is. And lastly, an unequivocal scriptural injunction of non-resistance and passive obedience. This goes back to when Charles I and Charles II had sort of been pootling about in England a century earlier. They had decided that they should be able to do what they want, and parliamentarians had sort of said, no, we don't like this. So that there was a sort of a civil war with them. And what they formulated was this idea that people, because you've been put into power by God, at no point should anybody be able to tell you, or nobody should be able to resist you. Let's put it that way. You may be able to say things to a king, but you shouldn't resist a king because that was God's right alone. So therefore, a government and a nation should listen to and obey regardless. And if you pick up a Bible and read Romans 13, you can sort of see the roots of some of this. Where if you have a bad king, you basically have to sit there and put up with it. James I, who put together he didn't put together the King James Bible, but was responsible for organizing the committees that put together the King James Bible, did so largely because the previous Bible that was very popular in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in the continent said, or at least had a gloss in the margin of the book. In a book, you normally have the main text, and down the sides of the text, you'd have little helps to tell you how to interpret difficult parts of Scripture. And some of those said that it was possible to resist an evil king. And James I didn't like this. And so he sort of made sure that this wasn't going to happen. So, excuse me. Those are the Jacobite characteristics. I don't want to spend too long on them, simply because they will pop in and out, and I don't want to spend too much because I want to get through the terms. The next group are the Whigs. Now, if anything, the Whigs are for constitutional monarchianism. In other words, this is kind of a little bit in opposition to the other groups that we're about to talk about. But it's an idea that both Parliament and the monarchy work together. And now, previously, kings had always just done their things without Parliament, and Parliament had subsequently ratified whatever the king had happened. So if you go back to the kings like Henry VIII or something like this, Henry VIII controlled his parliaments. He called his parliaments when he wanted them to do something for him. But by the time we get to the 1600s, this model has changed. And so Parliament begins to feel that they actually have an important part to play in the politicking of government. So they are constitutional monarchists. And I guess in a way, we still sort of are in England. I mean, we still have a monarchy. It still is sort of theoretically in power. But they are very firmly against the idea of absolute rule. So this would put them in opposition to the Jacobites, for example. They are against the Stuarts. and hence 1688, which again, if you want to look at my previous videos, you can have a look and see what happened back then. But they are very firmly Protestant and therefore against all forms of popery and Catholicism. They don't like it. They don't like them, and by the time we get to George III, the Hanoverians came into play, and the Whigs essentially dropped out for quite some time. I'd like to say a good 100-odd years or so. But they are, at least at this point in our historical walk, they are still very important. And those are just the Whigs. They are sort of in opposition to the Tories. Now, the Tories are the name Tory actually comes from a term for a cattle raider. It's a Gaelic term for a cattle raider, and it was originally a term of abuse, much like Christian used to be a term of abuse, and then was adopted as a as a sort of a mantle of I don't know what of, but some sort of mantle to sort of say, look, we are pleased with this moniker. So the Tories become the Tories, and the most famous probably of this is William the Pitt. And these had a number of a number of very significant parts to play in British history. They had, and this is where this is why I need to cover the Whigs and everybody else. They'd supported James II against the Whigs. They were largely monarchist supporters against a strong parliament, and that is still largely true today. We still have a Tory party. It's obviously not exactly the same a Tory party, but it is ultimately made up of the upper classes, who I'm going to say are largely anti-democratic. I don't think that's necessarily a feature of this particular group of people. I think it's just a feature of people who get to the top of any situation of any society. They tend to be anti-democratic simply because it means that their positions are safer that way. But the Tories are incredibly strong supporters of the Church of England. And again, there's a whole sort of background history, which maybe I'll talk about in a little while about this, where the Church of England, which is the official Church of England and has been since sort of Henry VIII, but largely filtered down through Elizabeth I. This is the official Church of England in contradistinction to all the many other churches, including Catholicism, but all the broad churches, or the non-conformist churches, Protestants, general Protestants, like maybe Lord Adventists would be like today. The Tories were discredited by the Whigs for the 1715 Jacobite Rising, and so kind of kept out of the way until George III came in 1760. So for a while, the Whigs were in ascendancy and quite prominent, and the Tories were in the opposite of that. And then it flips back, and we have the Tories come back into power, and this is the situation that we have. So those are kind of like the main people. Now, as I said, it's really important that we talk about different elements and I'm going to start with religion. Now, again, this is a lot of stuff that maybe you might find a little above where you are, and that's okay. I don't mind that you don't know these things, but you just need to try and catch up as best as you can. But religious identity is incredibly important because, as Linda Colley, one of the historians of the time period, has pointed out, that Protestantism is a key building block of national identity. In other words, who you are as a British person is really tied down to your religion. And in this particular case is Protestantism. People tend to, I think, define themselves when there is an external force against them. And I think probably this is what happened to the British. They were under siege from so many elements on the continent, the French, the Spanish, and popes and whatnots, that the English defined themselves probably because of the opposition more than maybe any sort of sense of internal identity. At least that's just my sort of personal view. But religion, at least at this point, infuses absolutely everything that people do. It infuses party politics. It infuses or at least it produces the challenges to the Georgians from the Jacobites that we talked about. It is responsible for the situation in Ireland, and there is a continuing situation in Ireland on many different levels. It is behind anti-slavery. It's behind how women are treated. It infuses the Enlightenment, or at least it provides a foil for the Enlightenment to fight back against, and we'll talk about that in another lecture as well. It infuses the attitudes towards the press, towards class consciousness. It is literally everywhere. And let me share another slide here if I can find one. This is a bit of an unusual slide, mostly because it's talking about something that we generally don't have in England. But I'll just show you, and I'll explain it as we go. Here we go. This is the Constitution. This is what's known as the Constitution of England. Now, as you may see from its picture here, that it's a tripod, and obviously, if one leg in a tripod falls over, the rest of the tripod collapses as well. So we've got different elements in here. But what I'm really sort of most interested is looking at the texts in the bottom here, where you have religion as part of one of the things upon which a good society is formulated. And again, if you want to look at the other lectures from the previous class, you'll sort of have a bit more of a deeper understanding on this. Excuse me. But it is something that sort of goes through absolutely everything. I'll stop the share there. There's this idea that runs through government, and this is not unique to the United Kingdom. I think this is pretty much everywhere. It is not unique to England, this idea that religion is behind absolutely everything that needs to happen. It is in every country, because everybody is a Christian. There are no atheist states yet in Europe. There may be atheists, and they do have a particular definition. They're not quite the atheists as what you think as to atheists now. But that will be in exchange, and we'll talk about that when we talk the Enlightenment. But anyway, religion is very important. And excuse me, sorry, I'm just going to cough here for a second. So yes, sorry, excuse me, I have a terrible cold here. As we said, it infuses everything. There are three pillars of society. It's the crown, it's the aristocracy, and the church. And that's what those three different sticks sort of did. And so it is a vital part of what is taking place. And so we need to talk about it a little bit more. There is what we call a historiographical question about the Church of England. Historiography is how we write about things. When we write about history, the argument generally tends to be is that when we write about things, what we're really writing about are the problems in our own time. And so when you read a historian, they are writing about something in the past, but really they are expressing many of their own fears and questions and issues of their own time period at the same time. And so when people write about things, it's really a question of, it's really a question of being meta about what you're doing when you're writing history. So this is all a historiographical question about the Church of England. Was the Church of England in decline? Was it vibrant and central? For example, J.C.D. Clarke's talks about the Ancien Régime, the idea of church and state entwined. It endures all the way until about 1828, and then the turning point is the 19th century. The Whigs had a sort of a different interpretation. The Glorious Revolution in 1688 ushers in this whole new period of toleration, of reason, where religious conflict is replaced by secular liberal politics. People stop thinking of politics in religious terms. We've entered a new age of reason, and they also go back to 1688 as the turning point. So we have two sort of very different ways of thinking about history that all point back to this one same point, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 / 1689. and they go in different directions. And it's an interesting question. I'm not expecting anybody to answer this, but it is something, a way of sort of thinking about it, because we tend to think that the Whiggish interpretation is actually true. We've become more tolerant, we've become more reasonable as time goes by. I think possibly the Enlightenment helped us go down that route, because that really begins to secularize things. And so I think in a way, the Whiggish interpretation probably is the stronger way of interpreting what is happening over this century. Mostly, I think, because people do stop thinking about religion in many different ways, and it no longer is a defining question. It's no longer a defining identity in people anymore. It may be important, and it's still there, and it's still talked about, and there are still arguments about it. But I think politics definitely begins to move away from talking about this. Anyway, so talking about this Church of England, the Church of England has has a number of different challenges. So if we're going to talk about the Church of England as being a defining part of this time period, then we do sort of have to have a look at it. There are some very clear inequalities in the clerics who minister in the Church of England. There's an inquiry in 1812, so this is a little bit later, but there's 1,000 parishes which have no minister whatsoever. And there's a report that comes out in 1833. The 1830s and 40s were times when they were sort of big into reporting and writing things down. In 1833, 47% of ministers had an income of less than £200, which I probably should pull out a calculator somewhere that has a look and gives you a comparison to that. It's not a terrible amount of money, but for a man of the cloth, it probably could be higher than that. And so people aren't paid very well. It tends not to attract that many people anyway. And so the Church of England is in a sort of a crisis. It still is in a crisis, to be honest. So we've got a challenge of how of the people running the church. There's a problem in that the parish structure is not very responsive to the major social changes that have taken place. Now, if you imagine England is divided up into lots of different areas that they're geographical and sort of ecclesiastical areas. So I live in Binfield, and so we are the parish of Binfield, and we have somebody who looks after us. And Binfield is quite a small village. It's never been very big. But there are places in the rest of the UK where you would have an area that was largely empty, was a single parish, and then suddenly, over the course of maybe 40, 50 years, thousands, tens upon thousands of people move into the area because of work issues to do with the Industrial Revolution. And the structure that supports the church does not follow or equal the things that are taking place within that area. So, for example, Manchester, which is a massive industrial area and wasn't before, had one church for about 20,000 people, which, of course, you cannot fit that many people into a church unless if you have some sort of American megachurch going on. So it's a bit of a problem. We have a problem inside the church. There is a legacy. Well, sorry. There is an issue, I suppose. There are differences of theology within the church. A lot of this goes back to, well, I guess this is a legacy of the pre-revolution. And when I say revolution, I mean the Glorious Revolution. We have a split in the Anglican Church. We have High Church and Low Church. And High Church is mostly what we call smells and bells. It's fairly Catholic. If you imagine sort of a fairly traditional Catholic Mass done in Latin, with candles and bells ringing and incense being swung around and the whole thing done in a language you don't really understand, that's kind of what high Anglicanism is about. Low church Anglicanism, or low or broad church Anglicanism, really is something like what you and I are more used to in an Adventist setting or in a Baptist setting or something like that. It's more evangelical. And when I use the term evangelical, I don't want you to think of Americans. I want of American evangelicalism, because that's being corrupted now to, I think, to a point where it's very difficult to understand what it is, but more to do with churches that are interested in preaching and teaching. And that was the case back then. So we've got a sort of split in the Anglican Church, high and low, and then we've got not opposing that, but in addition to that, you've got non-conforming churches. So you've got the Catholics, who are obviously not Anglicans, and then you also have what we call dissenting Protestant denominations, or dissenters for short. They are non-conforming. In other words, they do not follow the rites of the Anglican Church. They may not follow its theology either. There is a certain amount of toleration for most of them. Obviously, sects do arise, and crazy people do turn up and start sort of causing trouble, and they get shut down fairly quickly. But those are the competition. That is the competition to the church. So this is the Church of England, and there are two main challenges from the outside. The first is anti-popery. There is a long tradition going back to the Reformation, and there are enduring myths about conspiracy. And of course, if you're a good Adventist, you'll have some of these conspiracies floating around still. I'm not passing judgment on whether they're true or not. I'm just saying they're there. But the Pope is the idea, of course, is that the Pope and Catholics are out to get Protestants, which obviously it was technically true at many points in history, and that is exactly the case. They were. But a lot of this comes to a head in 1688, 1689, the Glorious Revolution, when everybody gets rid of James II. I mean, that is why we have a Glorious Revolution. And so a celebration of the Glorious Revolution is, in a way, a celebration of anti-Catholicism. During the time period before this, a Catholic conspirator by the name of Guido Fawkes and a group of other conspirators attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament and failed. And as a result, everybody every year on November 5th held a bonfire, and they celebrated with sort of rudimentary fireworks and bonfires, and it was basically a giant party. And from the period of 1688 onwards, parishes paid a lot of money to make sure these festivals took place. In other words, it became a defining sort of moment about it. So our anti-popery goes back pre-Reformation. We also have Jacobite plots. Now, the Jacobites, in a way, are simply arguing from a legal perspective that they should be allowed to, well, their king should be the one who's still king. That's essentially what it is. The problem is that the king that they think should be king were Catholics, or were incredibly sympathetic to Catholics, which in a time when Catholics were externally representing a threat to Great Britain, or the UK, no, I'm going to call it Great Britain, is not a clever thing to be doing. It may be legal, but it's not. It doesn't go down well. It's not a populist argument. So there are many anti-Catholic measures put in place by the government and by successive governments against against the religion itself and civil participation in the religion. This has happened before. Elizabeth I definitely made some practices very, very difficult for Catholics to perform, which meant that it ended up really in the hands of the upper classes, the rich people. But this still continued on. So she was sort of in the 1500s. We're here around the 1700s, and they are banning Catholic priests. Catholics couldn't practice law. They were excluded from a wide variety of government and local government and civil service positions. Because what would happen is that they'd say, okay, if you want to be a judge, or you want to become a minister of parliament, or you want to become a justice of the peace, you have to put your hand on the Bible and sort of swear and say that you are going to follow the Anglican Church, and you're going to take communion in that church at least once a year. And this, of course, would not be possible for a Catholic. So you are excluded simply by the nature of who you are from certain aspects. It's a bit like some Adventists who don't do things on Sabbath, and so because I don't do things on Sabbath, that means I can't do certain things. So anyway, this is what we got. A lot of this anti-popery had to be rethought, however. So we've got this very long tradition of being anti-Catholic, but it had to be rethought, mostly because a couple of things. The Jacobite threat began to recede. So, as I said, the Jacobites are very important. They're pushing for their king in exile to be returned, or his heir to be returned, and that just eventually, over time, dissipated. And so it becomes less of a pressing issue. The British Empire is beginning to grow, and it has as part of Canada, Quebec, which is Catholic. So what do you now do? You have part of your empire is Catholic. How do you fit them in there? So do we begin to see a measure of religious toleration, perhaps? There are simply more Catholics around. The Irish immigrate to England in large numbers. We had 60,000 in 1720 and 750,000 by 1850. And so there is a beginning of a softening towards Catholicism. And so in 1788, we have the Act to Relieve Catholics. So this is the idea. This was an idea to remove penal legislation against Catholics, and it was it resulted in an awful lot of hostility. I'm going to share my screen again and show you some just a couple of pictures. Where are we? Here we go. This is Lord Gordon in 1789. You can see he's holding a stick, and that stick is pointing towards, depending on your screen size, it's pointing towards something called the Protestant petition. This is a petition of lots of people, led by Lord George Gordon, where they said, no, we shouldn't allow Catholics back in to do this. We shouldn't remove this legislation against them. And so there are all sorts of riots about this. Let's see if I can find some. There's an attack. Yes, there's an attack on Newgate Prison. There's big rioting. 60,000 people get involved. 210 people are killed. There are all sorts of arrests. And this is an example here of a print. You can see of a printed sheet. These are very rudimentary forms of propaganda, which are printed in vast quantities and spread around. Lots of people are arrested because of all of this. A lot of fear-mongering is whipped up against Catholics. But civil emancipation is still on the agenda. So while there is a lot of popular fear and anger and hatred towards Catholics, it's not universal, and it's not necessarily shared by many people in government either. So in 1791, for example, Catholics are granted legal existence to have places of worship. Before then, you could only have a place of worship on your own private land, which generally meant it was only the upper classes. It was the aristocracy who could have a place of worship. In 1828, the Test and Corporation Acts were repealed. So these are the things that you have to swear that you're going to go and take communion in an Anglican church and blah, blah, blah. They had to repeal this because a Roman Catholic won in Ireland, and they didn't know what to do with him. And so it kind of pushed things over. And in 1829, Catholics won a measure of emancipation, and this split the ranks of the Tory party and created a crisis in the church. It doesn't really matter why, but just the fact is that there has to be some sort of changing in the way that we are treating Catholics, simply because we no longer live in those same times as we used to do. So that's Catholicism and the issues that you might have with that. So let me stop that share there. Now, the next bit. So that's one challenge to the Church of England. We have the anti-popery, the Catholics, essentially. There is the other challenge is what we call old dissent or Protestant old dissent. There are a lot of Protestant sects around, people like Quakers and Baptists, and they are tolerated in 1689. So after the Glorious Revolution, they are tolerated. You could meet as long as you met in an unlocked building, so you couldn't meet behind doors and have dubious conversations. But it doesn't allow you to. You are tolerated insofar as that. Now, it doesn't mean that it's favored. You're allowed to do it, but it doesn't mean that they love you that you're doing this. So, for example, atheists are not tolerated. Atheists, again, do mean people who do not believe in God, but there is a tendency from about the 1600s. Atheism is largely defined in heresy. It's not I don't believe in God. It's I don't believe God. I don't believe Jesus is God, or I don't believe that Mary is a virgin, or whatever it happens to be. That is really what atheism really meant originally, and then it turned into I don't believe in any God whatsoever. So you couldn't have anti-Trinitarians, for example. This is a big thing that's actually popping up in the Adventist Church at the moment. You had to believe that God is in three. You can't have three in one. You can't sit there and say that, well, God is divine but not Jesus, or something like that. So dissent isn't favored, but it is tolerated. But there is still hostility to dissent around 1689. But the nature of Protestant dissent changes as well. So by the mid-1800s, for example, we have what we call rational dissenters. These are anti-Trinitarians, as I said, not really tolerated. They stress reason and natural rights, which at least may be familiar to those of you on the American side. For example, J.B. Priestley is a famous one, and I'll find a little picture here to share for you so you can see what he looks like, or at least what we think he looks like. Here we go. Here's J.B. Priestley. J.B. Priestley is calling for the head of George III. And as a result, a mob came along and destroyed his house, which was very nice of them. J.B. Priestley was a Unitarian minister, but he was also a scientist, which, of course, is a curious mix of both rationalism and also belief. But this is the time period. There are other more radical forms of dissent and belief. I have said that atheism tended to be really heresy rather than I don't believe in God, but pure and proper atheism is beginning to turn up, along with deism, and we'll talk about that with the Enlightenment. Thomas Paine is probably the most famous one on the American side, along with maybe I want to say it's Benjamin Franklin, but I can't remember. It's the guy who chopped out bits of the Bible that he didn't like. I can't remember his name, but if he comes back, I'll mention it. So we've got some rational dissenters like that. We've also got people like the Methodists, who are the forerunners of much of Adventism. Methodism generally, well, it was a movement within the Church of England to begin with. John Wesley, of course, is the most famous one. He had an exceedingly energetic campaign to spread his version of what he understood. Or sorry, not spread his version, but spread his vision. He preached 40,000 sermons in 50 years, which works out to be 2 sermons a day for 50 years, which I think is pretty impressive, especially for those of you in the theology department. Hundreds of thousands of people received the message of Methodism. And it actually doubled its numbers during the Napoleonic Wars, which I think might be a response to stress. People tend to turn to God when things go wrong. And so when it looks like your country might be invaded, people tend to become religious. What unites all of these people, I suppose, is an idea of moral reform. And I think a lot of this moral reform is in response to the many stresses that are actually taking place, the problems of the time. So, for example, urbanism. We've moved from a very, very rural and agricultural economy into a fairly urban and burgeoningly industrial economy. And I think this mechanization it produces stresses, and we'll talk about the people who write about that. We'll talk about Marx and Engels, who write as a direct response to these changes. There's a vast amount of alcoholism. People drink way too much. There are the famous gin, the problems with gin alleys, where people just get blind drunk, and women would leave their children to sort of go crazy and sort of die in the streets because they were looking after them because they were so drunk. I mean, it's a major, major problem, much worse than what we have now. There are also the sort of the general the problems of immorality, such as prostitution and things like this, which is, I suppose, not tolerated, but maybe people don't look very hard at it. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. So this moral reform is looking at a wide number of things to reform. And so between 1689 and the 1720s, there are about 75,000 prosecutions for immoral behavior, however that's defined along different ways. And there are lots of societies that spring up as a result of all of this. For example, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which I think is actually still going. They still have a publishing house in Britain. And they publish sort of little books. There's the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Overseas. Everybody's really big in societies. In the 1780s, after the Americans defeated the British, there's the Sunday School Society of 1785. There's the 1787 Proclamation for the Encouragement of Piety and Virtue. I mean, all these different things. Wave of reformers trying to suppress vice in their religion. And this is kind of borne out in 1851 by a man called Horace Mann, who does an analysis of the Church of England and realizes that only about 1/3 of the population ally themselves with the Church of England or the Church of Scotland. There are lots of dissenters in Catholics. There's a lot of religious indifference. I think he figured out that only about 1/5 of the population was in church on any given Sunday. Now, there are problems with his methodology, as always, people who try something new, there's always an issue with it. But still, it shows that a very large number of people are not interested in religion at all. And so that is not a good thing. For the Church of England, this is a problem. And so I suppose Christianity was being depoliticized, as in it's no longer part of government, and also demystified, which I think is part of a response to the Enlightenment. The characteristic Anglican tracts of the late 17th century had titles like the reasonableness of Christianity, which I think is a problem. We'll talk about that maybe when we get to class. Or things like Christianity is not mysterious. Where God had sort of once been in and of everything, when he was in the very warp and woof of nature and life, he now becomes much more of the deist God, a God who sort of winds up a clock, and the clock is sort of made in such a way that the clock will keep ticking. There has to be a creator to make that clock and to set the clock going, but once you take that, the clock can run without the creator. So he then becomes the creator who sets things going, and a spirit that works within people and individuals and kept them obedient to morals. Sermons stressed the merits of neighborliness and charity. Ministers were encouraged to preach about, ministers were taught or told really that to preach meant that your religious duty was to do things like be kind to old people and animals, rather than preaching about the transformation of the world. You can sort of begin to see there's a move away from the evangelicalism of the Reformation. So from the dissenting side, John Locke, for example, preached for religious toleration, defined a church as a voluntary society of men meeting together to worship God in whatever way they seemed appropriate. So religion had become an unthreatening matter, almost a hobby. I think many times, and you'll see this today when I read the internet, people sort of complain about this. They sort of think that religion is something that should be private and shouldn't get slapped around in other people's faces. I think this is where we are beginning to see this begin to sort of be seen. This is how it starts. It starts back, and I know I keep talking about the Enlightenment, and I will go back to that at some point, because it is this breakdown of a worldview that used to be dominated by religious imperatives. This has now collapsed, or is beginning to collapse. So I mean, you can see it in things like theatre, the Restoration theatre. So the theatre from 1788 onwards differs from the Jacobeans mostly in terms of its secularism. Metaphysical poetry, people like John Donne, they would root their religious experience in the natural world, and this gave way to a religious poetry which is much more cerebral, or very sort of coolly rational. And I think this is really the beginning of the end of church, or of Christianity, I suppose, as a defining force within British politics. Now, as I said earlier on, we're not at the end of it. It's not. This has not happened. It is still an important part of British life. It is still an important part of people's lives, but it is no longer the defining moment. It's no longer the defining elements of a society. I'm just going to stop that share now. It's no longer the defining parts of this. It is really something that is beginning to be sidetracked. And as we go on throughout the semester, you will see that we will talk less about it. We are less interested in religious identity, but we are going to be talking more about political identity and politics, and that is much more the defining element of what we have to talk. Right, so I'll stop there, and then I'll come back a little bit later, and we'll talk about some other issues to do with politics and political identity in this time period.